Good morning, everyone. My name is Jan Zakowski, and I'm a trustee of the Washington Institute. This plenary session will be devoted to a discussion of the topic that may be the most urgent and important issue on the international agenda: how to deal with Iran's nuclear program. As you can see in your program, we've titled this discussion, Iran Policy Options: Prevention, Containment, and the Nuclear Challenge. We are fortunate to have with us today a panel of experts who have been at the center of the Iran nuclear debate for many years. For years, conferences like this one have focused on the issue of Iran's nuclear program. But with the clock of Iran's progress toward a bomb ticking ever more loudly, and with sanctions about to tighten even more around Iran, and with the Iranians and the international community engaged in negotiations, this is no longer a long-term issue. This is an issue of current urgency. This morning's discussion will not be a briefing about the technical state of Iran's nuclear program. Rather, today we are focused on the core policy issue of how to stop Iran from marching toward a bomb. Currently, America is leading the world in an effort to convince Iran that pursuing nuclear weapons capability is not worth the benefits. That's what the sanctions and the negotiations are all about. But what happens if diplomacy fails? Should the U.S. pursue other means to stop Iran from getting the bomb? Or should America shift to a more traditional strategy of deterrence? A strategy of convincing Iran that it would suffer enormous harm if it actually considered using the bomb. And tactically speaking, what price should America be willing to pay in the current negotiations to produce a successful outcome that frees us from ever having to face these unpalatable alternatives? These are very serious questions, perhaps the most serious a president can face. And to grapple with them, we are pleased to have a panel of very serious policy practitioners. We had expected Dan Senor to be with us this morning. However, Dan was unable to come here and had to withdraw from the conference a couple of days ago, but not without first helping us to secure an outstanding replacement, Jamie Fly. Jamie served in the National Security Council in the Bush administration as Director of Nonproliferation, a post in which he was responsible for, among other things, the Iran nuclear file. He currently serves as Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative, a project that brings some of the brightest lights of the conservative policy community together to engage in the great issues of the day. We thank Jamie for his willingness to step in on such short notice and for being with us this morning. Our second panelist is Colin Kahl, an associate professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, and a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. In December, Colin completed almost 2 years of service as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, the senior civilian position in the Pentagon with responsibility for the Middle East. Among things competing for top spot on his agenda was the Iranian nuclear challenge. To moderate this discussion, we are delighted to welcome back to Lansdowne our dear friend, Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis rejoined the Washington Institute as counselor in December of 2011, after serving nearly 3 years in this administration. First as special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, focusing on Iran, and then as special assistant to President Obama and senior director for the Central Region at the National Security Council, also focusing on Iran. Dennis, it is a real pleasure to have you back home with us. And now let me turn this session over to you.
Thank you, Jan. I think Jan framed the issue very well, and I don't want to take time because we want to hear from our two speakers. I just want to make the point before they begin. Jan identified this as as one of the most urgent national security problems. It's also, I think, fair to say that this is the kind of issue that requires and deserves a very genuine searching debate. There are important points that can be made on both sides, and one of the fortunate things we have today is that we have truly outstanding people who will come at this, I think, from points of view that aren't the same, but it may not always be as black and white as it might seem, because the nature of this issue doesn't always lend itself to such clean and clear distinctions. So without further ado, I guess, Colin, are we going to start with you? All right, so Colin and then Jamie will go, and then after each of them speak, I'll direct some questions to them before we turn it over to you to direct some questions to them.
Well, good morning. It's great to be with all of you. As Jan said, I just spent about 2.5 years in the Obama administration, and because of that, I need to do the obligatory caveat that, I'm here speaking as an individual, in my radically free stature as an academic with tenure. That allows me to say pretty much whatever I want without getting fired, which is a good luxury in life. But really, I'm speaking just for myself. When Rob and the other organizers of this conference asked me to speak to this topic, they frame the issue in terms of policy options down the road. That is, if the current approach being taken doesn't work, should we adopt a policy of deterrence and containment of a nuclear Iran or of military confrontation? So when evaluating the question of whether a nuclear Iran could be containable, I think it's imperative to start by asking containing what? And here I want to focus on 4 potential dangers a nuclear-armed Iran might pose. There are many, many dangers a nuclear-armed Iran might pose, but I want to focus on 4 that are probably both the most serious but also the most commonly noted. One is the prospect that Iran, with a nuclear weapon, would actually deliberately use that weapon, either directly or by transferring it to terrorists for use against Israel, against the United States, against others. A second danger that I'll talk about is whether nuclear weapons would embolden Iran to be even more provocative, a bigger supporter of proxy activity in the region, bigger supporter of subversion, terrorism, etc. A third is whether a more crisis-prone relationship between Israel and a nuclear-armed Iran could lead to miscalculation and escalation, and perhaps even nuclear war. And then last, whether a nuclear-armed Iran would set off a regional cascade of proliferation across the Middle East. So what about this first issue, the prospect that a nuclear-armed Iran would deliberately use or transfer a nuclear weapon to others? Notwithstanding the abhorrent rhetoric of Iran's leaders, the actual behavior of the Islamic Republic over the past 3 decades reveals, in my view, a sufficient degree of rationality for nuclear deterrence to operate much like it did during the Cold War. As the Washington Institute's own Michael Eisenstadt notes, the perception of Iran as irrational and undeterrable is, quote, both anachronistic and wrong, unquote. There is simply no evidence for the claim that the current Iranian regime, as abhorrent as many of its activities are, is a suicidal state. To be sure, Iran's revolutionary leadership has demonstrated a repeated willingness to support Islamic militancy and use violence abroad to promote their ideological agenda. But they have also demonstrated a degree of caution, sensitivity to costs, and the ability to make strategic calculations when the regime's survival is at risk. This should not be surprising, since the survival of the Islamic Republic is a precondition for meeting every one of the regime's material and ideological objectives, including the success of the Islamic Revolution in Iran at home and the spread of Iran's Islamist ideology and model abroad. Thus, I agree with former Israeli Mossad chief Meir Dagan and the current IDF chief of staff Benny Gantz when they say that the regime is rational. And, most importantly, if the Iranian regime is indeed rational, a nuclear-armed Iran will realize that a nuclear attack on Israel or the United States or any other nuclear power would be suicidal, and basic deterrence in this context should hold. The prospect that Iran would pass a nuclear device to terrorists to use against Israel, the United States is also exceedingly low. Iran is the world leader in state-sponsored terrorism. There's not a debate about that. But it generally calibrates the support of terrorist activities to minimize the risks of direct retaliation and confrontation. And whatever risks it might have been willing to run in the past by launching attacks against Israel or the United States, these risks would pale in comparison to the gamble Tehran would take by using a terrorist organization to deliver a nuclear weapon against either Israel or the United States. In the aftermath of an anonymous terrorist nuclear attack sponsored by Iran, it is likely that a forensic investigation would identify them as the source of the device, potentially triggering massive retaliation. And regardless of the evidentiary findings, Israel and the United States would undoubtedly hold Iran responsible for the use of any nuclear device by a group known to be associated with Tehran. Nothing in the regime's past behavior suggests it would run the risks of annihilation that this scenario entails. In fact, Iran already has weapons of mass destruction. It already has a capability both in the chemical and biological arena. It already has close relationships with terrorist organizations and militant organizations, and yet, to the best of our knowledge, has never passed weapons of mass destruction to a terrorist organization precisely because of the concern for massive retaliation. What about a second implication? The notion that a nuclear-empowered Iran would be emboldened to increase its support for proxy activity and terrorism in the region and across the world. I think this is a real threat. In fact, I think the most likely outcome of a nuclear-armed Iran is that all of the things that it's doing now would be dialed up to 11. All right? I think that's a very real concern. Look, Iran doesn't just have defensive motivations, okay? The goal of the regime is not just survival. They also want to be the dominant power in their region. They want to expand their influence. They have ideological objectives, okay? They don't just have defensive motivations. In a sense, they have revisionist or offensive motivations. Currently, Iran calibrates the level of support it provides to proxies, the amount of terrorism it conducts abroad, to a level below which it thinks would trigger massive retaliation. I think there is a significant prospect that a nuclear-armed Iran that would increase the threshold of risk that the Iranians were willing to take in supporting proxy activity and terrorism abroad, because they would feel that their nuclear arsenal created a deterrent that allowed a lower level of violence to be safe. Right? We actually have considerable experience from the Cold War for this dynamic. The Cold War scholars used to call this the stability-instability paradox, whereby deterrence at the strategic level actually enabled lower-level conflict. So while the superpowers never engaged in World War III, they did fight each other repeatedly in the Third World through proxy conflicts. I think the same logic also applies in the India-Pakistan scenario, and we should expect the same thing to apply to Iran. So I think this is a very significant concern. There are two caveats, though, that I think are worth mentioning. One is that the net impact of nuclear weapons is uncertain, and stopping them from getting nuclear weapons wouldn't stop Iran from supporting proxy activity and terrorist activity. Right? So right now, their activities are dialed up to 6. Perhaps with a nuclear weapon, they'd be dialed up to 10. But if you eliminated their nuclear capability, they'd still be active at 6. Okay, so eliminating the nuclear problem doesn't get rid of the terrorist challenge or the militancy challenge posed by Iran. The second thing is that we shouldn't automatically assume that Iran's proxies, even though we call them proxies, will do everything that Tehran says. Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, they all have their own agendas, they all have their own constituencies, and even if Iran itself becomes more emboldened, it's unclear how much more aggressive Hezbollah would be towards Israel, Hamas would be, or Iraqi militants for that matter, would be in Iraq or elsewhere in the Gulf. What about the possibility of crisis escalation? Even if one subscribes to the notion that Israel and Iran or the United States and Iran are rational actors and basic deterrence can hold in the sense of either any of those countries intentionally using their nuclear weapons against another, there's always the possibility of miscalculation, misperception, and a crisis escalating out of control inadvertently. Okay? Obviously, when you're talking about Iran and you're talking about its relationship with the United States and Israel, there's not a lot of trust. There's a lot of hostility. There are no direct means of communication. And if crises become more common because Iran is more active in the region, then there are scenarios in which you could have inadvertent escalation to nuclear war. Right? And that is a very significant challenge that we have to take seriously. That said, I think there are two factors that mitigate that risk somewhat. The first is that even if crises become more common, the most likely forms of crises for Iran will be supporting proxy activity and third parties away from the Iranian border. These actions are done. The reason why Iran supports proxies and terrorists is precisely to put itself at one remove from those activities to avoid retaliation. That is, Iran understands that at the end of the day, these are peripheral conflicts and peripheral interests, and they have every incentive not to make these peripheral crises into an existential crisis. Why does that matter? Because Iran will basically have the choice. If there's another 2006 Lebanon war or another cast-led type of operation, Iran will have the choice whether to turn a crisis like that into a nuclear crisis. Right? They don't automatically become nuclear crises. Iran has to choose to do that. And there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that Iran would choose to make these peripheral conflicts something that are existentially central to the survival of the Islamic Republic. Moreover, if you look at the pattern of Iranian behavior over the last couple decades, every time their proxies get into trouble, Iran abandons them. Every time. Because they don't want direct confrontation. So it's of my view that the Iranians are likely to be more assertive in getting their proxies to do things, but that they're unlikely to turn these crises into nuclear crises. What about the fourth implication, a proliferation cascade? You know, I just came back from 5 days in Tel Aviv, and without exception, the people that I talked about about this issue were concerned that the minute Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Egypt would follow suit, Turkey would follow suit, and most especially the Saudis would follow suit. A couple of things I think are worth mentioning in this context. The first is, I think, as proliferation scholars will tell you, after the initial 5 countries that developed nuclear weapons, there was a slew of predictions that the floodgates would open and that there would be 20, 30 more nuclear powers within a few years. As a matter of history, there has never been a nuclear cascade, ever. So we need to keep that in mind. That doesn't mean you couldn't have one in response to a nuclear-armed Iran, but there wasn't one in the late 1960s and early 1970s when the world assumed that Israel developed its own nuclear capability. There hasn't been a nuclear cascade in Northeast Asia as a consequence of North Korea developing its nuclear weapons capability. So we shouldn't take it as an article of faith that the floodgates will automatically open if Iran develops a weapon. I also think we have to keep in mind that Egypt, for the foreseeable future, will be broke and internally focused, and are probably a couple of decades away from being able to generate this capability. The Turks have more capability, but they also have an ironclad NATO security guarantee and the presence of U.S. Nuclear weapons on their territory. So they already have a nuclear deterrent. Right? The Saudis are more problematic, not so much because the Saudis would develop a nuclear capability themselves, but the notion that they might buy one off the shelf from Pakistan. I think this is a real danger. That said, you know, on both sides of the equation, the Saudis doing this would mark them as an outlaw state alongside North Korea and Iran, violating their NPT pledges. Pakistan, in providing a nuclear weapon, a wholesale nuclear weapon, something that no other state has ever done in history, would also mark itself as an outlaw state. I think it's more likely that the Pakistanis might offer an extended deterrent guarantee to the Saudis, perhaps positioning Pakistani F-16s in the kingdom with nuclear weapons on them. But then the Saudis will have to decide whether they'd rather have an extended deterrent from Pakistan or rather have an extended deterrent from another much more capable nuclear power such as the United States. And honestly, it's not obvious to me that they would choose Pakistan, which is India-focused and has no incentive to get into a nuclear war with Iran, over some other country that was able to provide the kingdom a much more ironclad security guarantee. So, what does this mean for the issue of deterrence and containment? My view is that theoretically, the principles of deterrence and containment should be applicable in the context of Iran. But practically, it'll be very, very, very difficult. There are a lot of uncertainties, right? And in this part of the world, uncertainty and volatility tends to lead to conflict, and thus we would have to be concerned that if deterrence or containment fails, that the consequences would be quite dramatic for our interests, quite dramatic for the interests of our partners in that part of the world. So while I think deterrence and containment are theoretically possible, they are not preferable. Prevention should remain the #1 priority. All right? I should also say that the Obama administration and President Obama himself has been extraordinarily clear that containment is not the policy of the United States, nor is it going to be the policy of the United States. Right? The Obama administration, the Bush administration before that, the Clinton administration before that have all said that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable. This administration has said that developing a nuclear weapon is a red line. Secretary Panetta has said that on a number of occasions. The president has made clear that all options are on the table, and that containment is not, to include military force, and that containment is not his policy, nor will it be, and that he doesn't bluff. All right? So I think it's important to keep in mind that as a matter of policy, there's not a lot of debate here. As a matter of policy, the policy of the United States is not to contain a nuclear-armed Iran. My own view is that the military option needs to be kept on the table, both because there are a narrow set of circumstances in which maybe it should be used, but also because the credible threat of military action actually enables diplomacy. All right? I want to conclude, though, by saying that if we are to ever contemplate, we, the United States, taking military action against Iran, I think we would have to answer 4 questions. Okay? The first is, have we exhausted all other options? The answer to that question as of now is no. Sanctions and diplomacy are starting to have an effect on the Iranian calculus. We need to let that process play out. So that's the first question. The second question is Iran driving for a bomb? Definitively. There's no evidence that the Supreme Leader has made a final decision to turn the nuclear capability that they are generating into a nuclear weapon. If they were likely to dash for a nuclear weapon anytime in the near future, we would see it. If they were to do that, it would be a game changer, but as of now, they haven't made a final decision, and so the threat is growing, but it is not imminent. So that's the second criteria. Are they going for a bomb? The third criteria is, are we convinced that that military action could significantly degrade the program? I think U.S. military action could significantly degrade the program. All right? The fourth is, and this is very important, the fourth is, have we built a large enough international coalition so that going into this conflict, we can mitigate the substantial downside risks of military action with Iran? Retaliation, instability, a possibility of conflict in the Strait of Hormuz, the effect it would have on gas prices. All right? These are huge, huge, huge effects. Do we have the type of coalition that can mitigate those effects? And I would argue, most importantly, on the back end of a strike, keep Iran contained. Yes, I said contained. A military strike does not end the Iranian nuclear program. And most likely, a military strike would incentivize the Iranians to reconstitute their nuclear program. The only way this makes any sense is if you have a large enough coalition on the back end to keep them isolated, contained, sanctioned, so that to prevent them from reconstituting their program. So the model for this, I think, of these four criteria is the 1991 Gulf War, not the 1981 Israeli strike on Osirak in Iraq or the 2003 Iraq War, but the 1991 war, where the United States led a large coalition, pummeled Saddam, and in the aftermath it was able to compel him to accept no-fly zone sanctions, intrusive inspections, et cetera. So one of the reasons I've been so critical about the Israelis taking action against the Iranian nuclear program is, at this moment, they cannot satisfy any of those four criteria. We haven't exhausted other options. We're not on the brink of Iran developing a nuclear weapon. The Israelis cannot set the program back very much, and they are incapable of generating a large coalition, either to mitigate the downside risks of a strike or to contain Iran on the back end. And so I'll just conclude with, a lot of times, containment is viewed as an alternative to military action. It is not. If military action is done the wrong way, military action would be the prelude to the need to contain a nuclear-armed Iran. So if you're even going to contemplate military action, it needs to be done the right way, not the wrong way. Thank you.
I want to thank the Washington Institute for inviting me. I've appreciated the work the Institute has done over the years, so I'm very happy to be here today. I actually think that, oddly enough, there are a lot of areas of agreement between Colin and myself when you look at the current situation with Iran. If you look at the theoretical possibilities of what would result if Iran does indeed choose a nuclear weapons capability, I actually agree with a lot of what Colin laid out. For myself, and I think, as Colin noted, where the Obama administration has ended up, the real fear about the implications of a cascade of proliferation and our, in my view, inability to prevent such a cascade are one of the primary reasons we should be willing to look at some of these other options and very seriously at the military option. I think you can have a debate, as Colin presented, I think, pretty fairly on some of these issues on both sides, about questions about whether the regime is rational, about how having a nuclear weapons capability would affect its relationship with its proxies. But I think that there's enough ambiguity and uncertainty in each of those that I think we need to look more seriously at the military option, and I'll lay out the reasons why. The way I understand it, our current position, the United States position under the Obama administration, is that, as Colin noted, they do not support containment, but there is still time for diplomacy, negotiations, and perhaps additional sanctions that can have a crippling effect on the regime and bring them to the table to work out some sort of equitable solution. I have three problems with this I want to lay out. First, I don't agree that we have time. Secondly, I think that diplomacy is unlikely to work given the track record of our interactions with the Iranians over the last decade. And in addition to that, I would actually also argue that I think we're basically at the point where we're running out of additional sanctions that we and our international partners can impose on the Iranians. And the third point I want to make, just in response to where I see the current administration headed, is that I fear that even though I think the president, I take him at his word that he does not support containment, and he's concerned about the implications of a nuclear Iran, I fear this current path we're on is actually leading us on down the road towards essentially accidental containment, that we're going to stumble into a situation where, because of an intelligence failure or our prolonging of the use of the military option, that we really have no other options when Iran basically gets to that point. So on the first, why do we not have time? I think the facts on the ground are clear. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. You just look at the IAEA reports, you look at the number of centrifuges that Iran has enriching uranium, you look at the expansion of the facilities now, the two known major enrichment facilities, you just look at the stockpile of LEU, again, that we know of. There's also the concern that I don't think often gets enough attention about what we don't know, what other facilities they may have, what other enrichment stockpiles they may have, the possibility that they could even get fissile material from other sources, such as North Korea. These are all factors that significantly impact timelines when you have those sorts of discussions. In relation to the question of how much time we have, one of my biggest concerns about our current debate is, and you hear this from multiple senior administration officials, and Colin repeated it, is this notion that they have not made the final decision, and that many administration officials even go further, that we would know when they make the final decision, and that's when we can act. I think, just from the perspective of someone who's followed the intelligence community's work in this area over the years, I think that's a very dangerous position to put us in, especially when you look at nonproliferation experts' estimates about timelines. We're really talking, in some cases, a matter of months. And those who think we have more time, maybe 1 or 2 years, there's a very high possibility of miscalculation. And I think assuming that we will automatically know when that final push is made, even if you agree that it has not already been made, which I think you can have a debate about that, I think that sets us up for failure. And so I would argue that we're actually within the margin of error essentially right now. There are a number of independent experts who have basically assessed that Iran is essentially nuclear capable at this point, even if they only have a few remaining steps to take. My second point, diplomacy won't work. I think that you just look at the track record over the last 10 years, essentially since Natanz has been revealed. There's obviously this myth that's often propagated that for a large part of the Bush administration, there was no engagement with Iran, there were no offers made to Iran. The fact of the matter is the Europeans, and eventually with the Bush administration, were always talking to the Iranians, both overtly and also behind the scenes. A lot of the proposals that you see circulated now in the run-up to the Baghdad talks in several weeks, I mean, these are nothing new. These are the proposals that have been on the table for years. And so I would just fundamentally question why, at this point, is Iran any more likely to accept any of these limited proposals. And a lot of them are just actually confidence-building measures, which would not actually resolve the problem anytime soon. I also couple this skepticism about diplomacy with a concern that perhaps we're running out of additional sanctions that could be imposed if, say, Baghdad talks don't produce anything. I remember vividly towards the end of the Bush administration in some of our meetings about actions that should be taken against Iran on the sanctions front. One senior official described 1 or 2 of the remaining actions as the final bullet in the shotgun. And I can tell you that the Obama administration has now deployed at least what he was referring to at the time as the final bullet. Now, there may be 1 or 2 more bullets that we found, but I think we are getting to the point where we have a decreasing amount of leverage with the Iranians to actually force them. Now, sanctions have had a major impact on the Iranian economy, and perhaps that's why the Iranians are now more willing to at least go through the process of talking, but I don't have a lot of hope that what will come out of Baghdad will resolve this situation. I would also argue that part of our problem with the diplomatic track, and I think that the president has recently kind of pivoted on this issue, but over the course of the last 3 years, the Obama administration has not been consistent at all about the military option in terms of its public rhetoric. I think that you just need to look and compare various administration statements. You have a lot of tough talk about the military option being on the table, coupled with a lot of senior officials describing the disastrous or supposed disastrous impacts of a military strike. And I think if it is true, and I believe it is true, that the military option and keeping it on the table is an important part of trying to force the Iranians to be serious at the negotiating table, I think, unfortunately, these mixed messages have complicated that effort over the last 3 years. So given what I just laid out, my fear is that we're actually setting ourselves up for containment, whether we realize it or not. It goes to questions of what if we are wrong, that Iran has already made the decision to develop nuclear weapons? What will happen after a test or after we realize that it's too late? Will the Obama administration be willing, or any future administration be willing to use force at that point after we've missed some key intelligence? My other concern about saying that we're in favor of the military option and prevention, but this is something to be reserved for some time in the future, is at least the current administration has been very ambiguous about what would actually provoke a military response from the United States. Many of us in the nonproliferation community thought, for instance, that when Iran was caught with constructing another covert nuclear facility, that this might be the sort of thing that would demand some sort of response. They've already increased their enrichment levels, obviously, from 5 to 20. So if they enrich and start enriching instead of up to 20 to 90%, would that provoke a response? We don't know. There are no clear red lines that have been laid out for Iran. So from an Iranian perspective, I don't think that we in the United States or the international community have been very clear at all, with perhaps some hinting that if Iran kicked out the IAEA inspectors at Natanz and now Qom and was seen transferring enriched uranium to some other site, that might provoke a response. But I think there could be a lot more clarity on the red lines. So given what I've just laid out, obviously, I do think we need to think more seriously about the military option. Now, when it comes to the military option, again, I think there's actually a lot of agreement between Colin and myself. I'm not in favor of a limited strike. I think that there are questions about the extent of Israel's capability to adequately set back the program. I do think that if the United States gets involved, we actually should also not limit ourselves to a limited strike. I agree that this is not the Iraqi program of the 80s or Syria's program in the late 90s, 2007. Those were limited programs with just several facilities. I think the extent and scope of the Iranian program is such that there would be a long list of targets that would need to be struck to ensure that the program could be adequately set back. And I also think we need to understand that if we do engage in military action in Iran, that it will be a serious conflict with Iran. Some of the proponents of a limited strike argue that we would be able to dial back any Iranian response through back-channel messaging, and I have problems with that and think that in the fog of war that would be unlikely to happen. So what am I advocating? I think we need to take a broader approach in looking at the problem. The fact of the matter is that it's not just the activities of Iran at Natanz or Qom or its other nuclear sites that should concern us. This is a regime that for decades has killed Americans and U.S. allies, both directly and then indirectly. Most recently, and I think we in the United States have not done enough to respond to this, they've killed our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. Colin discussed Iran's support for its terrorist proxies. Obviously, I don't need to tell anyone here about Iran's abysmal human rights record. And in general, all of this has just contributed to instability in the region, negative impacts on global energy markets. And so I think we have a broader set of concerns with the regime. And it's really the nature of the regime itself that is why we are so concerned about Iran's nuclear program. It's not just the facts on the ground. So I would couple this interest in looking at the nature of the regime itself when we're thinking about a military option with the fact that my sense is that the U.S. military does not plan limited options. We often hear this, and we have heard it over the last year in the debate about both intervention in Libya and now Syria. The U.S. military prefers to go in, take out air defense sites, reduce the ability of countries to respond. And so my guess is if you turned to the military planners at the Pentagon, they would come up with an extensive operation that would likely just, even if you were targeting the nuclear program, would last several weeks. They would take out elements of the IRGC Navy. They would go after even some limited command and control likely that would prevent Iran from attacking our assets in the region, as well as likely Israel. And so what I have written about and advocated is, if we're already, and assuming that we go down this route at some point, if we're already in this sort of conflict with Iran, why not make at least part of our goal an attempt to shake up the situation and undermine the stability of the regime? This could be done by just expanding the target list. Already I noted, I think that any U.S. operation would likely go after some aspects of command and control. I think you could go after leadership elements. You could go after elements of the regime that have been used not just to target the United States and others in the region, but also to target the Iranian people. And with that hope, I would think we could hope that perhaps we could create a space for the opposition to rise up and to eventually change the regime. Now, I'm not arguing that this would be certain, and I'm not arguing in favor of some sort of ground invasion, but I do think it is something that needs to be considered if we head down this road. Is it now the time to attack? Because I know this is something that often in this current political season comes up. Governor Mitt Romney has been accused of being a warmonger, a supporter of endless war, because he's, at least in his rhetoric, been somewhat more hawkish than the current administration. I would argue that the longer we wait, the less viable our military option becomes. I agree with Colin that the United States military could handle this task, but if, as some Obama administrations have described, the specter of some sort of conflict with Iran is so undesirable right now, how will it be any more desirable 1 or 2 years from now as the Iranian program expands, as the Iranians develop other capabilities? And so I do think that time is of the essence, perhaps once the current diplomatic process expires. So I would actually argue in the 4 points that Colin laid out, again, there's a lot of agreement between Colin and myself. I guess we just might have a different take on some of the points he highlighted. Have we exhausted all options? I actually think we're about to. Is Iran driving towards a bomb? I think you can have a debate about that. I would tend to be more concerned that they have already made that decision, or even if they have not, that they're actually lining themselves up to be at the point where they don't have much of a lag before they can get that capability. Could military action degrade the program? And the sort of action I'm outlining certainly could. And then the final point is perhaps the one where we might have the most disagreement, is whether an international coalition could be built to support this sort of operation. I think that would probably be the most difficult. You're not going to have broad multilateral support. I do think there would probably be several like-minded allies who could be convinced that this is also the best option, given the nightmare scenario that we would face if Iran does indeed develop nuclear weapons. So I guess I'll just end by asking the question, are we as a nation serious about preventing a nuclear Iran, or are we just serious about talking about preventing a nuclear Iran? I think we're getting to the point where that is really the fundamental issue. And I'll just end with a quote from Churchill from 1948, who talked about what would happen when the Soviet Union gets the atomic bomb. He said, "What will happen when they get the atomic bomb themselves and have accumulated a large store? You can judge yourselves what will happen by what is happening now. No one in his senses can believe that we have a limitless period of time before us. We ought to bring matters to a head and make a final settlement. We ought not to go jogging along, improvident, incompetent, waiting for something to turn up," by which I mean waiting for something bad for us to turn up. And I think we're in a very similar situation. I don't think we want to have to deal with decades of attempting to contain Iran and deter Iran in a polynuclear Middle East. And so I would just argue that I do think that we are reaching a key moment here, and we need to more seriously consider a robust military option against Iran.
Well, as promised, I think what you got was an extremely thoughtful presentation from 2 people. I do think that there are a lot of areas of overlap, and there are some areas of difference. What I'm going to do is, in my role as a moderator, is make one comment on a point that each of you made, and then I'm going to pose a question to each of you. You might interpret the comment as being a question as well, so feel free in that regard to take it as such. Colin, in terms of the comment, when you say that the Iranians really haven't made the decision yet to go for a nuclear weapon, a final decision. And Benny Gantz has said the same thing. But it's both a real point, and it's not that it's irrelevant. It is relevant, but it also misses the point. Because the fact is, if they have a nuclear weapons capability and they accumulate 50 bombs worth of material, and they then get to the point where they solve their problems with the next generation of centrifuges, they really will have a dash time where they could confront the world with a fait accompli. They're able to choose the point at which they go nuclear, and they can do it in a way that we would find very difficult to prevent. So in many ways, the issue of not having made the final decision to turn the final screw is relevant, but there's a larger point that also has to be addressed. And I would just make that comment for you. Jamie, when you raised the question, why would diplomacy work now when a lot of the ideas that have been basically, that are about to be presented are really just warmed over ideas from the past? That's absolutely the case. I mean, this is last night, Naguib Sawiris said that when it comes to Egypt, he doesn't want to reinvent the wheel. And the truth is, when it comes to the diplomacy, most of the ideas are not going to be reinventing the wheel. There'll be variations on ideas that have existed before. But there is a reason why it might work now. And that is that the Iranians are under dramatically more pressure than they've been before. Internationally, they're isolated in a way that they haven't been before. One of the best indications of that is the vote that took place in the UNGA, not exactly a body that is typically friendly to anything we want, that was 106-9. They campaigned very hard to prevent that vote. They worked hard to try to ensure the resolution wouldn't take place. No Muslim majority country voted with them, so they're isolated internationally. The balance of power in the region is clearly shifting against them. The readiness of their Gulf neighbors to be much more publicly critical of them than has been the case before is an indication of that. What's happening in Syria is one of the reasons that the balance has shifted against them. They clearly feel a degree of discomfort on that. When the Saudis immediately said, after the European Union declared that they would boycott the purchase of Iranian oil, and the Saudis came out immediately and said, we'll fill in the gap, and Iran said this is an unfriendly act, and the Saudis then responded by saying, we'll balance the whole oil market. This is, again, an indication that the context in the region is changing. And now they're facing much more profound economic pressures when their currency has been devalued by half, when right now they have they're not selling about 400,000 barrels a day of oil that they would like to be able to sell. They're putting it on ships. They're running out of the ships to be able to put it on. Everywhere you look, they're under a different kind of pressure than before. And one of the reasons they're at the table right now is and they're talking about their nuclear program, and they're being prepared to engage on confidence-building ideas, is that they're under the kind of pressure that a year ago they weren't under, and a year ago they refused to discuss those issues unless all sanctions were dropped and unless the right to enrich was accepted as a precondition. That doesn't exist anymore. Now, none of that says necessarily that we're going to have a deal, and I'm not suggesting it, but it does at least suggest that the context has changed, and that's why diplomacy might be able to work. Okay, those are my comments. Now let me pose a question for each of you. Colin, I think of the 4 points you posed, the 4 dangers that you identified, I could raise questions about a lot of them, but I'm going to raise questions only about the cascade. Because for the cascade idea not, in fact, to materialize, you need to have countries in the region who are prepared to accept the kind of extended deterrence and assurances that would be required, and let's take the Saudis as the prime example, that would be required for them to have a high enough degree of confidence that such assurances will hold. Now, the Obama administration is the 3rd administration that has said Iran can't have nuclear weapons. Clinton said it, Bush said it, Obama said it. So after 3 administrations say you can't have it and then they have it, I wonder who is going to take our assurances very seriously. And I think the Saudis in the first instance would not be all that keen to do it. And there's an additional reason why, quite separate from the question of assurances, as to why the Saudis would run the risk, as you said, they could become a kind of pariah state if they went ahead and they decided to buy the weapons. But from their standpoint, number one, if they see themselves in a position where Iran has this capability and they don't, they see themselves at a huge disadvantage. It's emotional, psychological. This is their main rival. They have a major edge over them. Can the Saudis, the king being the custodian of the two holy mosques, given the context that we see in the region right now, would they really allow themselves to put themselves in such an inferior position vis-a-vis their main rival? And they might also conclude that given their weight in the oil market, they're like nobody else. They've always defined themselves as a balancer. Is the world really going to make them a pariah if they decide to go ahead and buy nuclear weapons? So my question to you is the kind of suggestions you made about the cascade being something that wouldn't necessarily take place, is that really likely to be the case? And Jamie, for you, I have a question on what I'll call the issue of context. The use of force is a means, it's not an end. If there is no military solution to the Iranian nuclear problem, because they have the know-how, the engineering capability, even if we go ahead and destroy their current capabilities, they can rebuild it. So the key to being able to prevent them from being able to rebuild is, and this is what Colin, in fact, said, you have containment after the fact. You use force and you have containment after the fact. But for containment to work after the fact, you really do need a coalition. You really do need a context. You really need to be able to ensure that the Iranians can't present themselves as a victim, and you really need to be in a position where others, not just a few selected others, but others are prepared to join you in terms of their isolation, the maintenance of the kind of onerous sanctions that we see now, both because, on the one hand, that raises the costs to the Iranians. They will have just seen their whole investment in their nuclear program basically destroyed. And if the prospect is they're under severe economic sanctions, that's not going to change because you have this strong coalition. The idea of them then deciding to go ahead and pour a lot more money at a time when they're not likely to have it is much less likely to be the case. So having such a coalition would be important. And I'd even say it would also be important for the second part of what you were saying, because you're also saying, can we do this in a way that increases the prospect that it could actually create more space for the opposition in Iran? And here I'd also just note, if the use of force is very extensive and you end up killing a lot of Iranians, I wonder whether or not that is going to create space for the opposition. I mean, one thing we know from every historical conflict, whenever you bomb somebody and you kill a lot of their people, they don't tend to blame the regime, they tend to blame the people who did the bombing. And so the nature of the military means that are employed, if in fact you're also thinking about a political consequence, needs to take into account both the significance of being able to contain the Iranians after the fact, and also the employment ought to be done in such a way that it doesn't increase or create a kind of lease on life for this regime. So those would be the comments and questions I would pose to each of you.
Well, let me say something about the comment. Actually, I think I agree. The decision itself is less important than the behavior. The question is whether we would see the behavior that was the manifestation of the decision, or that would tee the Iranians up to make a decision. And the question is, would we detect the behavior? I think at the moment we would. At least if you go by, what the intelligence community is saying through the press, et cetera. At the moment, for them to go for a bomb using their existing facilities would mean they would have to divert their stockpile of low-enriched uranium and enrich either at Natanz or at Fordo. We would detect that. Currently, it would take at least 4 months, maybe as long as 6 months, and the IAEA would detect that. All right? Now, there's the possibility that Jamie raised that they have a parallel program, covert facilities we don't know about. But if that's the argument, it's not an argument in favor of military action, because then bombing their overt facilities does nothing to destroy the clandestine facilities you don't know about, and in fact, they would simply rebuild and dash for a bomb using those clandestine facilities. So we either know where the program is and we can target it, or we don't know where it is, in which case targeting the known sites does nothing. At the moment, I think we would be likely to detect enrichment to weapons grade at Fordo and at Natanz. I also think if you, based on the unclassified NIE from 2007, as well as the IAEA report in November, that we would probably detect if they restructured their structured weaponization program, as opposed to these bits and pieces of dual-use activities. Those would be the types of activities that I think would be smoking gun evidence that they're going for a bomb. Now, a year from now or 2 years from now, could we have a lot more uncertainty? I think we could. So for example, if they have one or more bombs worth of 20% LEU, it shrinks their dash time maybe to a month or to 2 months, in which case your margin for error gets a lot greater. And so if they had a bomb's worth of 20% or a couple of bombs worth, that would worry me very much. All right? Which is, I think, one of the reasons why the 20% issue is so central to any confidence building or interim agreement that the P5+1 is talking with Iran. So we need to constantly reevaluate this. The basic point I'm saying is that I feel relatively confident today, as does I think our intelligence community. That answer might be different a year from now or 2 years from now, but that's a reason to make the decision on military force a year from now, not today. As it relates to your question on Saudi Arabia and the proliferation cascade in general, look, extended deterrence is hard. During the Cold War, our allies always asked, would you be willing to trade Boston for Berlin? And there's an intrinsic incredibility associated with extended deterrence. I should say, by the way, that Israeli analysts who worry very much about emboldened proxies because Iran would extend its nuclear umbrella over Hezbollah and Hamas should also remember that their extended deterrent it would not be credible either. So I think that we should keep that in mind. But I also agree that if, after saying that a nuclear weapon is unacceptable, it then became acceptable, it would undermine our credibility. And since credibility is essential to extended deterrence, it would undermine our ability to provide security guarantees. So I think that's exactly right. That said, we would still have a vital interest in countries like Saudi Arabia, and even if you can't trust in words, you can trust in interests. We would have a vital interest in not seeing Saudi Arabia be occupied, invaded, nuked. It's intrinsic to our economy, to the global economy, so the Saudis can have faith in that. Moreover, one of the reasons why extended deterrence is difficult is because the adversary can threaten the U.S. homeland. And so since you value your homeland more than you value your allies, you're not willing to run risks in a crisis in favor of your allies because you fear a nuclear war directly with the adversary. Well, at least for the foreseeable future, Iran won't be able to credibly threaten the U.S. homeland. Ballistic missile defenses, the fact that it'll take years for them to develop an ICBM capability, the fact that they are unlikely to deliver something by ship or some other way because they know that it would have relatively limited damage on the United States and would bring about massive retaliation means Iran cannot credibly hold the U.S. homeland at risk, which means the standard extended deterrence problem doesn't apply, at least for some period of time, in the Iranian issue. And then the question is, can you put tripwire forces? Do you deploy forward nuclear forces? These are all questions that you had to ask during the Cold War that we would have to ask in this context as well. The only thing I would say on Saudi Arabia is everybody focuses on the Saudi piece of this. You also need to explain the Pakistani piece of this. Basically, the argument is that Pakistan will do anything for money and that the Saudis will simply buy a weapon. Pakistan's number 1, 2, and 3 strategic objectives are India, period. All right? Or they're near abroad. The last thing Pakistan wants to do is to become embroiled in a strategic nuclear competition with Iran and get sucked into a nuclear war in support of another state. They also, after the AQ Khan fiasco, don't want to be known as the only country in history to have provided a nuclear weapon to another state. So I think the Pakistanis are less likely to provide it than people assume. I think the most likely scenario is that Pakistan would provide an extended deterrent guarantee. And like I said, then the Saudis will have to ask, would I rather have a Pakistani extended deterrent or a U.S. extended deterrent?
Thanks. First, maybe a brief response on the comment. I certainly would be the first to admit that Iran's situation today is much weaker than it was 5 years ago. I think a lot of progress has been made on the sanctions front. Clearly, the concern I have is that if you just look at the facts on the ground, Iran has continued to make considerable progress despite the sanctions and despite a lot of targeted measures, obviously, by the U.S. and others to actually go after key elements of the program. And so from that perspective, yes, in terms of the crippling economic impact that might be drawing them to the table, it clearly has not been enough thus far. The other concern I have is that the sorts of proposals, and we can have a discussion about whether it makes sense to ever allow Iran to enrich at all, which is you're heading down that path with some of the proposals on the table at present. From a nonproliferation perspective, it's a very dangerous situation to set up for yourselves where you basically legitimize Iran's right to enrich despite its repeated violations of international agreements it's signed. And there needs to be a certain, I think, assessment of whether we can ever sign some sort of agreement with this current regime and trust that they, in good faith, will implement it. And so I think that's a fundamental question that we haven't even really had a real discussion about. And I think from my presentation, you understand where I come from on that issue. I think that it would be somewhat ludicrous to expect this regime to act in full accord, to declare all of its sites, to allow full access. And we've seen this play out in other cases, too, with North Korea over the years. I mean, these are not easy tasks, and I don't think we're starting off on a good footing with Iran to make sure that we can have full confidence that their program was peaceful. The one other thing I'll mention is just it's not discussed a lot in the press, and when these proposals are put out about allowing enrichment at certain levels, is the whole history of Iran's weaponization efforts prior to 2003. The IAEA has documented this in its report late last year, and that's something that's not often laid out. It's referenced that Iran would have to answer all the IAEA's questions. I think people need to understand that for Iran to fully resolve the IAEA's concerns, it will have to essentially admit to the international community and to its own people that its leaders have been lying to the Iranian citizenry for a decade or more about their activities. I am very skeptical that this current regime would ever be willing to completely do that. And from a non-proliferation standpoint, we need answers to fundamental questions about what they were doing. We need access to key individuals. We need to understand their interactions with people like AQ Khan and where in the broader proliferation networks. And so these are not concerns that can just be swept under the rug. And so I think that obviously any kind of negotiations route with Iran is going to be an uphill challenge. And I think there's some fundamental questions that would make it unlikely to succeed. On the second, on the question, I think that, yes, I mean, after military action, this is why I don't support a limited strike, we would have to be in some sort of situation to maintain sanctions, maintain an international coalition to try to ensure that Iran does not speed up its program, does not take elements of the program and drive it further underground. I think that coalition, any coalition in general, is going to become much more difficult in even the next year or two. I have been in Europe twice in the last month. A lot of the European publics, I think generally, even a lot of European opinion leaders and policymakers, they're already shifting on this issue. And I would actually argue that President Obama does not have a coalition, international coalition, in support of his notion that containment is unacceptable. There just is no such broad agreement right now. Just all you need to do is talk to the Europeans. I'm convinced that the Russians and Chinese have already been in the position for years where I think they would be perfectly willing to accept a nuclear Iran. And so I think we're going to have difficulty even maintaining a fundamental coalition separate from the issue of military action. And so again, the reason I advocate a more robust military action is in the hope that you can avoid some of this very uncertain situation after a limited strike where you have to monitor the remnants of the program very closely that are then more difficult to follow, and you have to go back in every several years. I think that that also argues in favor of a more robust option. The one final thing I'd note is it's just a concern I have in general. If we are not serious about the military option, there are other ways that we and this is not just a response to the Obama administration, but also the Bush administration, I think could have, and at this point, the Obama administration should take these up, could put more pressure on Iran. We should be intervening in Syria. And President Obama has actually spoken about the fact that Assad's fall will be a blow to the Iranian regime. That's one way. Having a viable and effective Syria policy is one way to pressure the regime. We could have left forces in Iraq, which I think would have pressured the Iranian regime. We should have thought very seriously, and maybe this was already factored in, about signing a strategic partnership agreement with the Afghans that says we will never attack Afghanistan's neighbors from Afghan territory. Again, I'm not saying we should launch attacks from Afghanistan, but at least there should be some sort of strategic ambiguity that a U.S. presence in Afghanistan also puts pressure on Iran. And then finally, this is a bipartisan criticism, we should have been doing much more the last decade to support the Iranian opposition, especially after June 2009, but even prior. And I think there is a lot more that could be done in terms of providing training, funding, being more vocal in our support. The problem with all those measures I just laid out is there's a tendency to, as long as you're involved in the diplomatic process, not want to talk in those terms. Because once you start talking about regime change, you obviously are not going to be able to have serious negotiations with the current regime. But I think if the diplomatic track is really about to run out, we do need to think about a fundamental shift towards a regime change focused policy, even short of the military option, and we need to be more willing to take proactive measures that are aimed at actually pressuring the regime, rather than maintaining this notion that we can get to some sort of equitable diplomatic solution, which I'm just generally skeptical of.
Okay, I'm about to turn this over to the audience. I would say that the two things that stand out to me about the main differences between the two of you, I think you do differ on the question of timing, and I think you probably also differ on the question of a possible diplomatic outcome as well. But rather than have me continue to talk, I think we should hear from you. Okay. Yeah, where is he? Ali Heineman? Ali, did you have would you like to comment on what you've heard?
I'm asked and I'm unprepared, I can comment, yeah? So I think that the basic question here is that what is meant with the nuclear capability? And I would like to hear particularly from Colin where he draws the line and the red line. Because when I look and compare, for example, Iran today versus when, Colin, you talk about Iraq in 1991. 1991, Iraq didn't have really uranium enrichment capability. Today, when we look to Natanz, there are 9,000 centrifuges spinning, maybe another 1,000 at COM. That's the world of difference. If you look at the nuclear weapons-related studies, and if we think that the IAEA information is correct, I don't think Iran is very far from those rudimentary studies which were done by Iraq in 1990, 1991. So I think for the international community is here really to look when to stop this progress or march to the nuclear capability, because what we have here in question is also the NPT, because the Article 3 says that the objective is to prevent diversion of nuclear energy to nuclear weapons. Once this has taken place, actually you have missed your basic objective.
The reason I called on Ali and Patrick's instigation is that Ali spent 27 years at the IAEA, and he was the deputy director in charge of pursuing and looking at the safeguards agreement. So there are few people who actually know more about the issue technically, and actually there's probably nobody on the planet who knows more about what's actually happened on the ground within Iran itself. So that is the reason for his question, and if you guys would like to respond, that would be great.
So I think it's a great question. What is a nuclear weapons capability? I don't know. And neither do the Israelis or those in Congress who have put nuclear weapons capability into legislation or resolutions calling it a red line. What is a capability? In the 1990s, late 1990s, and early part of this century, the Israelis frequently talked about a point of no return. The point of no return was the red line. That was the point in which Iran mastered the fuel cycle. Check. They've done that. The point of no return was years ago. If you believe Jim Clapper, the director of national intelligence, they already have a nuclear weapons capability. If you mean the technical capability to generate nuclear weapons within a relatively short period of time, a year or two, they already have that capability. So I think that's why there's so much problem with using this term nuclear weapons capability, because nobody knows what it means, nobody has spelled out what it is, and if it's a red line, the red line is arguably either now or it passed long ago. I have no idea, about why the words are chosen as it relates to the Obama administration's current discourse on this topic, but they do focus very carefully on the development of nuclear weapons, not the capability, because I know that if they start enriching above 90%, that's a move towards weaponization, or at least I personally can define it as a move towards weaponization. All right? I know that if they bring the band back together and start a restructured weaponization program to get over those technical hurdles that would allow them to shrink the year total it would take for them to create a crude nuclear device and start to shrink that dramatically, I would also see that, me personally, as weaponization. So I can talk about weaponization. I have no idea what a nuclear weapons capability is, and as a result, I would encourage folks who use that term not to use it.
I actually think it's a question worth pursuing. I don't know that I have a clear definition of the capability, and I do think if whatever it means that Iran is probably already there or has been for quite some time. I do have a problem, though, with, and I talked a little bit about this, with I think where the Obama administration is on this focus on development of nuclear weapons, because if you just look, I have a lot of respect for the U.S. intelligence community, but if you look at their track record in assessing states' weapons of mass destruction programs, it's failure after failure, and I'm afraid we're setting ourselves up for another failure in this case. I even was struck, I was just reading some memoirs from the senior Bush administration officials, and when General Hayden briefed principals on the reactor at Al-Kabar, he even told them that he couldn't say with confidence of more than 50% that was part of a nuclear weapons program, which I just think is a good example of how, in the post-Iraq era, the U.S. intelligence community frames these sorts of issues. And when you're getting down to questions, again, of literally months or maybe a year or two, there is a great room for error. You look at some of the assessments about Iraq's, what we discovered after the first Gulf War about Iraq's programs. If you look at our ability to adequately predict when India and Pakistan actually crossed that line, or even China for that matter, we do not have a good track record. And so if we make this all about the actual development of nuclear weapons, we will likely miss it, and we will end up being in a situation where we, I think, are just going to stumble into containment.
I think the question and the answers also are a reminder that this is one of these remarkably difficult issues that poses all sorts of dilemmas. And I think both speakers have highlighted some of this. I'm going to call on the audience now. I got to tell you, I can't, because of the lighting here, I can't easily see faces. I can see hands, so I'm going to sort of direct. The people who I'll just call on people without necessarily calling on them by name. But what I would ask you to do is, would you go ahead when you're recognized and identify yourself, and if you're with part of an organization or you're a trustee, please also say that. All right, what I'd also like to do, because we have a lot of people who have hands up, and I don't know how much time we actually have, what I'd like to do is take 3 questions at a time, and then you hold your responses until we've heard all 3. And I will start, why don't I start in the back and work forward. Okay, I do see Jim Schreiber, Moses. I can't see the hand. I can see a hand back here, but I can't see who it is. Woman, yeah, there. So those 3. Jim, even though I identified, please identify yourself.
Is this on? Yeah, it's on. Okay. Jim Schreiber, trustee of the Washington Institute. Dennis, in response to the discussion from our panelists, you said that there are significant differences now in terms of the pressure on Iran. And I'm wondering how solid the current coalition that currently exists that's pressuring Iran will continue, because one of the elements that, at least in my mind, that led to the war in Iraq was the sense that the sanction regime against Saddam Hussein was shredding, the French and the Russians, particularly in the failure of the oil for food program. And so my question is now the optimal time in which either make a deal, or you're forced to either make a deal, or the Iranians make a deal, or you have to take preventive action because you have the semblance of a cohesive coalition?
Okay. Hi, I'm Susie Diamond. Dennis, I liked your comment about military action as means, not an ends. And I would think that we have learned over the years that, unfortunately, our country has a Department of Defense. We don't have a Department of Offense. And so I make this comment because I want to talk about other Iranian sanctions as one method we have used to try to weaken the regime. I'm almost certain that there's another option besides military, and I want to address this, dealing with our energy policy, that I would like to either one of you would like to comment if there's other options on the table that we can move forward in doing offensive instead of defensive in this area, in this arena?
Hello, I'm Moses Levitsky. I'm a trustee of the Washington Institute. And I just want to ask both our guests here. I think both of you mentioned that a credible military option facilitates diplomacy. And I'm just curious how we have a credible military option if there are those in positions of power and control who say, yes, we should, others say, no, we shouldn't, and others talk about the negative effects of taking a military action. How does that lead into a really credible option? And why, in the course of our negotiations, I don't know if it's just this administration or the prior administration, do we take the possibility of regime change off the table if we make it our stated policy that we will use regime change as well as a military option? Doesn't that also facilitate negotiation?
So let me answer the last set of questions first. Look, from the very beginning, President Obama has said that a nuclear weapon in the hands of the Iranians is unacceptable. From the very beginning, he said that all options are on the table, and to include military force. At the very outset of the administration, those arguments were in the background, and the reason was that we were very self-consciously testing the Iranian willingness to engage to have an engagement with us to resolve the issue peacefully. And so we didn't do the overt saber rattling to test whether that would be more likely to bring them to the table. By the third quarter of 2009, we had moved on from that. Look, we talked about before about the difference between decision and behavior. If you want to know about the credibility of the U.S. military option, look at what the administration has actually done. In the last 2 years, it's put an extra aircraft carrier in the region. It has deployed a bunch of ballistic missile defense assets, both on the sea and on land, and all of our partners. We've redeployed strike assets across the region. Even as we repostured from Iraq, we made sure that we kept 40,000 forces, more pointy objects pointed at the Iranians across the Gulf than are pointed at the North Koreans, and that doesn't take into account the 100,000 forces on their eastern flank. The president has not just said all options are on the table, those options have been made viable by decisions that the president's made. So they're not hollow, and the Iranians see these things. I mean, even in the last couple of weeks, you've seen the talk about the F-22 Raptors in UAE. Look, the Iranians understand what we can do to them. In fact, I think they fear us a lot more than they fear a possible Israeli strike, candidly. So I think that option is viable. But the president has also made clear that it's not the right time to deploy that option. And look, we could all pretend that a military option in this case would be easy. It'd be a cakewalk. They would greet us as liberators, shower us with flowers and sweets. We could pretend that there are no downside risks, that it could be a strike and not a war. We could pretend all of that to try to create this Jedi mind trick that we can do this effortlessly. It's not credible because that's not what the war would look like. And by the way, we already saw that movie. It's what we did in 2002. And $1 trillion later, 4,500 American dead, 33,000 wounded. We owe it to our democracy not to make that mistake again. All right? So we're going to have that open conversation. And you shouldn't criticize an administration official for saying, you know what, war is hell. And this war would be hellish, but we're still willing to do it. Because that's an honest answer, not a smoke and mirrors answer. So I feel very passionately about that, as you can see. The only other point I would make on how big of a coalition we have. Look, my sense is, and I suspect Dennis has a better feel for this, but that the Chinese and the Russians are pretty fed up with the Iranians right now, and that our experience in late 2009 and early 2010 is that when the Russians and Chinese are fed up, we're in a good position. The combination of the outing of Qom and the TRR backsliding, the Tehran research reactor backsliding, put the administration in a very good position in early 2010 to push forward the most dramatic, historic, unprecedented sanctions ever done by the UN Security Council resolution against Iran. I think we have to let the current diplomatic process play out so that if it fails, it's very clear that it's on the Iranians, and that would position us to forge a coalition much more effectively. And I will say that if we rush too quickly to a military option and try to build a coalition for that, the perception around the world in Europe and in elsewhere is that we're doing what we did in 2002, which is we're giving lip service to diplomacy, but we're just checking the box. Sanctions, diplomacy, checking the box on the way to war. That might be a recipe for sending a clear signal to the Iranians. It's also a recipe to shatter the international consensus that we currently have. So that's why the president talks about not having all this loose talk for war, not because he's against military action, ask bin Laden, but because it's not the right time, and loose talk at this time could actually be counterproductive.
I think I touched on the coalition question earlier, so I won't address that. In terms of is there another possible tool that we have short of military action, energy policy as reference? I'm all for diversifying our energy sources. I don't think that the timeline of the country actually doing that is such that matches up with the nuclear timeline. One thing I have always been frustrated with is our unwillingness to actually lay out specific red lines to the Iranians. Again, you could even, I would argue, connect them to specific things that if the lines of Iran crossed, the military action would result. But you could even set aside the military option and tie specific sanctions. You could get international agreement to tie specific sanctions to specific Iranian actions. I don't think we've done that effectively. If you look at the revelation about the Qom facility in late 2009, the leaders who announced that threatened immediate sanctions. I think it took something like 7 months for sanctions to be implemented. Our sanctions even have been disconnected from actual Iranian developments. And if we are in this situation where we're willing to wait until Iran actually makes the decision to produce a weapon and is not just capable, I think it's increasingly important that we are clear with red lines, so that maybe one thing short of military action. And then the other items I already mentioned, having an effective Syria policy to help ensure that the Syrian people remove Assad would be one option short of military action in Iran right now. Ensuring that Iraq does not fall apart and remaining as engaged as possible. I would have supported keeping troops in Iraq. And the other thing I'd say, getting to the third question about is our option credible, I mean, the problem with, I think the administration has done a lot of correct things, especially most recently in its rhetoric. The problem is when you talk about things about loose talk and you have senior administration officials talk about how devastating military action would be, if we are not even in the position where they're willing to consider it, the mixed messages are such, I don't think the Iranians get a clear sense that the administration is serious about eventually taking action. Clearly, the Israelis have a lot of qualms about whether this administration or even any future American administration, given all of our problems at home and all of the other places we're engaged with, are willing to take action. And so I understand what Colin's saying. I think certainly the way I've tried to lay this out, I've tried not to be overly optimistic about what a conflict with Iran would look like, and I think certainly there should be a debate. But I think that the administration has not, over the course of the last 3 years, been as consistent as it could have been. And then the one final thing I'll mention, and this again spans both the Bush and Obama administrations, despite what we've done in the region, despite our talk, there are specific Iranian acts that I feel we have not responded to adequately, mainly the targeting and killing of our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think the lesson that the Iranians have taken from that is that they can basically take very provocative acts against us, kill Americans, and have a limited response that may happen in the shadows, but that there is a limit to what the United States is willing to do. And I think that I personally think it's shameful, and I think it also has only served to embolden Iran's willingness to be more provocative in other areas.
Okay, I think we're getting a little more lively. I see, I'm going to restrain myself because there's a lot that's being said that is actually extremely interesting and is worthy of comment, but it should come more from, I think, from the audience right now. I called on Olli Heinemann because he has a particular background, and especially I see Amos Yadlin's hand, and I would like to sort of, instead of doing the next block of questions, I'd like to call on Amos, because many of you know that Amos completed his tour after 5 years of being responsible for Israeli military intelligence. So Amos, would you like to pose a question/comment?
I will do something that I hate. Instead of asking question, I will ask an answer. And I'm in the business of explaining why attacking Iran is a problem, is a very grave alternative. And I was very impressed by the 4 conditions to attack Iran that my friend Colin lay before you. But I'm very much afraid that all those who explain that it's too late to attack, it's too early to attack, and this is what we are doing in the last 6 years, will very soon come and say it's too late. It's too late. So the going from it's too early to too late is a very fine line. And one have to understand the Iranian strategy. And the Iranian strategy is exactly building on the issue not to let legitimacy to the forces that try to prevent a nuclear military Iran, because Iran is nuclear already, but it's not military yet. And they want to make the breakout from a nuclear Iran to a military nuclear Iran as short and as safe as possible. And this is a very sophisticated and smart strategy, and unfortunately working. And what we see today is that they are now taking the time to move from a nuclear Iran to a nuclear military Iran from 2 years to 1 year to 6 months, and when it will be 1 month, it will be too late. And we have to understand that there are two important parameters there. Is the capability to enrich quickly from the level of low enriched uranium to high enriched uranium, which today they need more than 6 months to have a significant military grade for a bomb. And the second is to do it in a time, and they are very smart, they know when the world is busy in other places. They will not do it when they see the coalition. They will do it when there are breaks in the coalition, when the P5+1 are not in good relation, when there is a crisis somewhere else, and they will do it. So the Iranians are very smartly maneuver us to a point that they can break out in the time of their choosing. And we have to be very careful that they will not be immune to do it in any time that they want. And this is the main concern that Israel has, that Iran is now getting into a zone of immunity, which means 3,000 centrifuges into a mountain near Qom that basically cannot be attacked in the future. And the time that we have to understand whether we exhaust, and I'm for exhausting all the other alternatives before going to the not preferable option of military attack, but it is preferable to Iranian nuclear bomb. I don't have time to argue against the arguments that my friend Colin lay forward. I think a nuclear Iran is much more dangerous than attacking Iran. And those who are not willing to contain Iran today when they don't have a nuclear weapon, how could they contain it when they have nuclear weapon? It's going to be much more difficult, much more difficult. And if the Iranians are rational, sometimes they are rational, still the possibility that they will make a mistake. Believe me, I have been there, near leaders. Leaders are not immune for mistakes. The Iranians may not, I think they will not launch a nuclear bomb the next day after they will have the bomb towards Tel Aviv. But the possibility that mistakes, escalations, miscalculations will bring at the end of the day the Iranians to launch a nuclear missiles is not something that we can ignore, because it is unstable. It's not in the 90s, 60s, or 70s. There is no red phone between Jerusalem and Tehran like there was between the White House and the Kremlin. There is no Iranian embassy in Tel Aviv. If you remember Bobby Kennedy going at night, sent by John Kennedy to Dubrovnik to de-escalate a crisis that nobody wants. And this is very dangerous. The flying time of a missile from Iran to Tel Aviv is 7 minutes. It's not 30 minutes. So all the mechanism of a second strike is not there. The temptation for first strike is huge. It's huge. So if we come at the end, when we exhausted all the options, the alternative between the bomb or the bombing is not so easy as it was presented here. Last but not least, if you really want to have all the options on the table, you should be very reliable with the military and credible with the military option. And the music, the whole world is hearing that this is not really a good option, and you don't believe in it. And you think that the consequences will be World War III. The Middle East will be in flames. So I don't think that this is the case. Our intelligence, speaking about a different Iranian reaction, first from capabilities, but more than that, interest. The Iranian interest is not to send the Middle East into flame. So if America, or not only America, if the Israelis who spoke against military attack don't want a military, here is the paradox. If you take the military attack off the table, at the end of the day, you should execute it because you undermine the other options. If the military attack is not there, we'll not get a diplomatic solution. If you don't want to use the military attack, you have to support it in all your might. And the secretaries of defense who are on the podium should speak with a lot of persuasion about the capabilities of the only superpower in the world to deal with Iran, and not to paint a picture that Iran is a 10-foot high opposition and America should do everything to avoid the attack. If you don't want to attack, you have to be a very credible military attack. That's it.
You know, there were two applause lines, one on that last one and one on containment. And I don't disagree with almost on either one of those. He and I have interacted repeatedly for 3 years on these things. The military option needs to be credible. I think what we disagree is whether, Secretary Panetta saying something at the Saban Center thing destroys the credibility of the fact that we have 40,000 pointy-ended objects pointing at the Iranians, and that the President of the United States has repeatedly said that all options are on the table and has been willing to use force in other contexts to defend American interests. All right? Afghanistan, Libya, in Pakistan against bin Laden. So look, we can have a debate about whether it's credible or not, but nobody's taking it off the table. Also, nobody on this table is arguing for containment. The problem is, if you don't like containment, the worst thing you should do is rush into a war. The worst thing is for the Israelis to rush into a war because it won't set the program back very far. The Iranians will redouble their efforts to build a bomb, and there will be almost no ability of the international community to contain a nuclear emboldened Iran on the back end. The second worst option is for the United States to rush into it before all other options have been exhausted and we're able to build a sufficient coalition to keep Iran bottled up on the back end. You know what? Israelis love to talk about the 1981 Osirak attack as preventing Saddam from getting a nuclear weapon. There's a debate, actually, about whether it delayed it or not, but I'll tell you, the only thing that prevented Saddam from getting a nuclear weapon was the fact that he was dumb enough to invade Kuwait in 1990, and the 1991 war that the United States led with a huge coalition, which then had 10 years of containment on the back end, intrusive inspections, no-fly zones. That's what ended his program. Right? That's what ended his program. So nobody's talking about containment, but if you hate containment, don't rush to war. In terms of that, it raises the question of, it's too early, but when is it too late, in this gray area in between? And I don't know the answer to that question. I think clearly the Israeli decision point is to the left of where our decision point is. And it's not about the intensity of the threat, although it's partly about that. It's mostly about capabilities, that the United States has capabilities that the Israelis don't have, and that your so-called zone of immunity, which relates to Fordo, is not our zone of immunity, period. It's not. So we don't have to go as soon as you do. And so that zone in the middle is covered with trust. This was your zone of trust that you talked about in your New York Times op-ed. So look, I think there are certain things the Iranians could do which would bring them much closer that I think would, if not bringing us to a decision point, at least make that discussion much more frank. We talked about the 20% issue. We talked about enriching to weapons grade, kicking out inspectors. There could be issues related to next-generation centrifuges, but they haven't done those things yet. And by the way, that's just not my opinion. When Benny Gantz said 2012 is not a go, no-go year, he was refuting Ehud Barak's zone of immunity. Full stop. Because the zone of immunity kicks in when Fordo becomes fully operational. At the current pathway, the Israeli leadership claims that happens by the end of 2012, and Benny Gantz is saying 2012 is not a go, no-go. So even for the Israelis who are looking at this, it's not so cut and dry. So let's take a breath. Let's let the diplomacy play out. Let's let the fact that the Iranians are finally starting to change their calculations under pressure. And let's not rush into something that could lead us worse off in the aftermath than before.
Okay. I might just, one interesting point of fact, it is interesting that apropos of the red line point you were making, when the Iranians were suddenly making noises about how they were going to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, a very blunt message was sent to them, and suddenly they stopped making those threats about the Strait of Hormuz. You might also note that they made threats that the Kennedy, that our carrier shouldn't come back into the Gulf. We sent the carrier back into the Gulf, and they didn't say a word. So I don't know that we've, there have been times clearly when we have acted in a way where they've said certain things and they've backed down immediately, which also suggests that I don't know that we really have acted as if we think they're 10 feet tall. But let me take another group of questions. Patrick, Yoram, Adam.
Patrick Clausen, the Washington Institute. Question to each of our speakers. Jamie Fly, could you please discuss what you see as the utility of the covert actions, such as assassinations and cyber war, encouraging defections, and sabotage, for slowing down Iran's nuclear program and giving us more time to decide whether or not we, what else we will do? And then to Colin Kahl, you talked about how you don't know what's a nuclear weapons capability. Well, I don't know what's a nuclear weapon. I mean, for 10 years, the US government certified to Congress each year that Pakistan did not have nuclear weapons, when we knew full well that Pakistan had every part of a nuclear weapon, in fact, every part of more than a dozen nuclear weapons, and had them 95% assembled. Because it would have been inconvenient for us to have said that Pakistan had nuclear weapons, that would have then kicked in congressionally imposed restrictions. So that illustrates the danger that Iran can make incremental progress and get further and further, and at every moment it will be politically inconvenient for us to say that, hey, the time's come to act, and that the temptation will be to close our eyes to what is this continual incremental progress, and it'll be difficult for policymakers to ever draw a red line short of a moment when it's too late to act.
Thank you. Yoram Perry from the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at University of Maryland, College Park. A question to both panelists, and you, Dennis, can join them if you want. Next week, the Israeli Knesset is going to meet to decide about early elections, probably in the 4th of September. The reasons for that are mainly domestic, but it has to do also with the topic that we discussed this morning. And the question, there are two positions concerning the impact of that decision on the issue of unilateral Israeli attack on Iraq. One group of people argue that within the next 5 months, the Prime Minister will not be able to launch an attack because of the election campaign and because he knows the American position. And therefore, we can postpone that option. The other school of thought argues that, on the contrary, Netanyahu will feel more secure to do it now, particularly after September. So between September and the re-election or the election of the next president here, Israel will launch. The question is, what happens if Israel does launch an attack and the Iranians react in a limited way, not on American installations and forces, but only on Israel? What will be the administration's reaction to that?
Adam Milstein, trustee from Encino, California. I've heard a lot lately that Obama policy of prevention is not because he's a great true friend of the State of Israel, but because he, from the beginning of his political career, he has a substantial interest in non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in the world. The way I see it is that at the end of the game, his policy of prevention is not just about Iran. It's about Iran and Israel. And to the extent that he will prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, it's going to cost Israel losing, being stripped of his nuclear weapons. Can both of you comment on that?
On Patrick's question on the reported covert actions against Iran's nuclear program, from what I've read in the press, I think if you just look, again, at IEA reports and open source information, the fact of the matter is sometime around 2008, Iran mastered centrifuge technology, if you just look at their production of LEU. Despite all of the talk and chatter, it was interesting in those early phases of the Obama administration, you'd see press reports quoting anonymous Obama administration officials kind of touting covert efforts as being a way to set back the program. If you just look at what the IAEA reports have shown, and ISIS has done some good reports on this, their production of LEU never really dropped, despite Stuxnet. I think Stuxnet destroyed a lot of centrifuges, which is good in the sense that it forced them to cobble together centrifuges, and they have limited access, I think, to some parts. But again, the facts on the ground did not really change. In terms of assassinations, I may have a chilling effect on ability or interest of some Iranian scientists to work in the program, but I think if you're getting to what Dennis was referring to earlier, if you just look at the scope of the Iranian program, set aside the small group of scientists who were likely involved in weaponization efforts, and you just look at the number of scientists who have cycled through Natanz or now COM, who understand how centrifuges work, how to operate, how to enrich uranium. I mean, this is not a number of scientists that can be assassinated one by one. It's just not possible. And so while these sorts of actions may have slightly slowed the program and caused Iran a lot of heartburn and made it more difficult for them to achieve what they've achieved, I don't think they're a silver bullet. And I actually think that at times, in terms of U.S. policy over the last decade, we may have been convinced ourselves that perhaps we could rely on these sorts of efforts rather than exploring other options. On the question about a unilateral Israeli attack this year, I would just say, Colin and I were talking about this before the panel. I think unilaterally, I agree with him that Israel acting alone this year is one of the worst scenarios, I think, in terms of actually resolving this problem. Now, that's not to say that I don't understand where the Israeli government is coming from. And the fact of the matter is that we even do have these fundamental questions of trust, that Israel has some, I think, valid concerns about where U.S. policy is headed if we're not serious about taking military action in the near future. I think just gets into the whole conversation we've had about how clear Obama administration messaging has been, because it has, I think, created some uncertainty in Israel. Now, if Israel acts alone, and there is only a limited Iranian response, I'm not quite sure that we can assume that, but if you assume that, I mean, obviously, I think the U.S. response would have to be focused on ensuring that U.S. assets and personnel are not attacked, and trying to ensure that whatever Israel needs in terms of its defense is provided. And then there is going to be, just because, again, the size and scope of the Iranian program, I think this very uncertain period where the United States and the international community are not going to have a good sense of what the true damage assessment was and what the Iranian plans are with the program. And it's going to, I think, it's not going to rule out that the United States would still not need to get militarily involved at some point. Finally, on the gentleman's final question, I actually think that this is an interesting issue. I was struck when I read the president's interview with Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, where he spoke at length about his concerns about the cascade of proliferation, and at least from that, it left me with the same assessment that perhaps that is really his driving concern, not to say that he's not a strong supporter of the State of Israel, but I do think, at least intellectually, that is what he appeared most concerned about. My concern with that, although I share his view and fears about the cascade, is the interesting thing to me in recent months, just like many of our European friends who now confronted with this very real question, are we willing to take military action or do we accept a nuclear Iran? I've begun to notice a shift in the nonproliferation community where you do have more, I'd say, nonproliferation experts who used to be fundamentally opposed to Iran getting nuclear weapons and willing to take all actions, now beginning to have discussions about, well, would there actually be a cascade? Some of the discussions that Colin was talking about, wouldn't there be ways to have extended deterrence? My fear is that at least the kind of think tank academic community could easily, in the next year or two, shift just like our European friends have and decide that an Iran can be contained. And so perhaps President Obama or other leaders who currently are concerned about this notion might follow that shift as well.
So, Patrick, your question about capability versus weapon. My understanding is the current language is development of a weapon, which describes a process as opposed to an outcome. It does beg the question of what that means, right? I mean, some of the issues that I've talked about, I think, starting to enrich above 90%, heck, enriching above 20% might be the line. Kicking out IA inspectors, restructuring the halted structured weaponization program, discovery of an operational parallel program, which is different from discovering a hole in the ground or something that is just a building. Those are all personal, possible red lines or decision points. Where it gets fuzzier is on the issue of 20%, right? How much 20%? One bomb, multiple bombs worth? What about next generation centrifuges, the IR-2Ms, the IR-4s, which would allow them to shrink their dash time dramatically? I do think both of those issues create a much greater margin of error when it comes to the intel question, which is why I think it's essential to stop the Iranian production of 20% and to ship out their stockpile, precisely because it gives us less margin for error. But I will say that while on the surface, providing red lines sounds like a good thing publicly, and I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu was pushing the administration to do that prior to the visit in March. There's a downside too, which is if you're too explicit, it encourages the Iranians to walk right up to that edge. And so I think what the administration has tried to do is split the difference. Some people are satisfied, some people are dissatisfied, but I don't think anybody should question the commitment and that there are certain steps that, at least at the moment, would be considered weaponization, I think, which we would see. 6 months from now or a year from now, that situation might be different, but we're not at 6 months or a year from now. As it relates to the possibility of an Israeli strike, I was just in Tel Aviv for 5 days. This was much the talk of the town in terms of the effect of the elections. I heard every possible theory. The most common theory, the conventional wisdom, is that Netanyahu can't go before the strike, too much uncertainty, plus he's too convinced he'll win anyway, so why monkey with that outcome? I heard others remind me, though, that Begin hit Osirak 3 weeks before the election, so you can't rule anything out. I've heard other folks say, well, he'll then have to go right after the election, but you have to form a government, and could he go without forming a government first? Who knows? There's also the possibility of the cast-lead scenario in which you go during a lame duck period or some other. So I don't know is the answer. And I don't think the Israelis know, and this is kind of a fun game for journalists and think tankers to play, but I don't think anybody knows except for Prime Minister Netanyahu and maybe Ehud Barak. What will it mean if they do it? I don't think we should assume the Americans won't get sucked in. The United States undoubtedly will support Israel in terms of its defense, which means we could be implicated in shooting down Iranian ballistic missiles coming at Israel. That puts us in the game. If the Israelis get in a slugfest, they're going to ask for resupply. That puts us in the game. So even if it's just retaliation against Israel, the Americans are in it from the beginning. Plus, it won't just be retaliation against Israel. It is inconceivable from the Iranian worldview that the little Satan would do something that the great Satan didn't greenlight, no matter what the administration says, which means they will retaliate against us. They'll probably do it indirectly. I would imagine within hours of the strike, there will be hundreds of rockets falling on our consulate in Basra and our embassy in Baghdad. I would imagine that the Iranians will start providing man-portable air defense systems to the Taliban in Afghanistan, things like that, to retaliate against us indirectly. I also suspect they will start to make threats in the Strait of Hormuz, if for no other reason, simply to get the international community to try to intervene to de-escalate the conflict. But in the context of making those threats in the aftermath of a strike and then moving things around, moving mines out of storage, dispersing their coastal anti-ship cruise missiles, putting their fast attack craft out to sea, putting their submarines out to sea, which, by the way, if I was Iran, I would do that regardless, to defend them because they have to be fearful that the Fifth Fleet will sink all that stuff. But all we're going to see, the Americans, is on the satellites, the Iranians making threats and dispersing their capabilities, which opens up all sorts of possibilities for miscalculation in the Gulf. So no one should delude themselves into the belief that even if Israel does this and the retaliation is minor, that the prospects of the Americans getting dragged into this is minor. It's not. It's not. So we should have our eyes open on that. I have no idea on the nonproliferation agenda. The only thing I would say in general is that there was a reason that Obama emphasized the nonproliferation components in the Goldberg interview, and that was that there was a lot of criticism that the Americans only talked about the threat from a nuclear-armed Iran in terms of the Israeli relationship, but didn't ever define it in terms of a threat to U.S. vital interests. This is a president who cares very much about the nonproliferation agenda, and so I think the Goldberg interview was designed to suggest that it's not only a threat to Israel, which Obama also said in that interview, but that it is also a threat to our fundamental interests because of the nonproliferation issue. How this would rebound down the road on Israel's alleged program, I have no idea, but I think that's how I would contextualize what the president said.
A sign from Rob that we have exhausted our time. We certainly have not exhausted the subject. And I'm quite confident we haven't exhausted any of you. This is, as we said at the outset of this, an incredibly important and complicated issue. It is an issue that needs to be debated and deserves to be debated. You've heard two people who I think are about as thoughtful as they come when it comes to dealing with this issue. And you've also seen two people who served in administrations, two different administrations, but it's also a reminder that the kind of people who are drawn into administrations are serious, thoughtful people. As someone who's worked across both Republican and Democratic administrations, the one thing I've always felt is people come in to public service for all the right reasons. It's not simple. Frequently you make sacrifices. And these are two people who are sort of the reflection and the embodiment of the best in public service. So please join me in thanking them for what they have to say.